What does a person leave behind when the curtain finally closes? Welcome to a tribute from Hollywood, a space where we pause to honor the American stars we've recently lost and the global figures whose lives shape the world we share. If these stories matter to you, your support helps us keep telling them. For anyone who followed The Only Way is Essex through its wild, sequin-soaked run as one of Britain's most talked-about reality shows, Jake was one of those personalities who felt inseparable from that era, the mid-2010s, when big emotions and bigger drama played out in front of rolling cameras. It could look effortless from the outside. Behind the scenes, life was rarely that easy. Authorities have confirmed his death as a tragic accident, with reports indicating he sustained fatal injuries involving a glass door while in Mallorca. The production company behind Toei released a statement expressing their deep grief and extending their condolences to everyone who loved him. Sometimes, quiet words are the only ones that fit. But Jake was more than a face on a television screen. He was a father, to his daughter River. He had stepped away from reality fame to build something of his own, launching a menswear label and pouring himself into fashion with the kind of restless ambition that some people simply carry with them wherever they go. Always creating. Always reaching for whatever came next. And that, perhaps, is what makes his absence sting most sharply. He was young enough that so much was still ahead of him. More quiet days, more second chances, more ordinary mornings with his little girl. Those who recall that glittery Essex world may remember the arguments and the drama, but today the picture is simpler and sadder, a young man gone, and a daughter growing up without her father beside her. Another reminder that life does not always hold its door open long enough for people to become who they were still becoming. Alex Ligertwood passed away at the age of 79. For those who carry Santana not just as a band name but as an entire atmosphere, something that seemed to pour out of every speaker during the late 1970s and 1980s, that news settles with a quiet, steady weight. His wife and manager Sean Browan confirmed his passing and spoke of a man whose entire existence was woven through with music. That feels true. Certain voices do not need much explanation. You encounter them once and they belong to a particular time forever. Alex was born in Glasgow, far removed from the California stages where his legacy would eventually take root. But when he joined Santana's orbit around 1979, he arrived carrying something raw and soulful, something that did not depend on flash or spectacle, only on depth. Songs like Winning, Hold On, and All I Ever Wanted threaded his voice into the fabric of people's everyday lives, car radios, living rooms, record shop afternoons, summer nights when rock radio still felt like a gathering place for strangers. Then came Live Aid in 1985, a single afternoon watched by the whole planet, the kind of moment that brands itself onto a generation permanently. He also brought his gifts to work alongside the Jeff Beck Group, Brian Auger, and the Average White Band. But for most fans, he will always belong to that Santana fire, the guitars, the rhythm, the heat, and that voice rising above everything else. It is a strange thing, how time moves. Songs that were new become memory. And the people who breathed life into them are eventually gone, leaving only the music to do what human beings never can, stay. Joe Ely has died at 78. For those who came of age when Texas music was cracking open and reinventing itself across the 1970s, losing him feels something like losing a stretch of highway you've driven 1,000 times. He was never simply a singer. Joe Ely was one of the rough-hewn voices that helped transform Austin from a city into a movement, back when the old boundaries separating country, rock, border ballads, and barroom poetry started giving way. His records carried dust and motion in them, truck stops at midnight, the buzz of neon outside roadhouse windows. He came out of Amarillo with all of West Texas embedded in him, and no amount of larger stages ever scraped it off. Fans will always hold close albums like Honky Tonk Masquerade and Down on the Drag, but beyond the music itself, they remember what those records felt like to live inside, mostly freedom, with a thread of loneliness running underneath. There was a directness to Joe Ely that felt impossible to manufacture. He went out on tour with The Clash at a time when no country singer was supposed to do anything remotely like that, and somehow it made complete sense. Punk audiences recognized him instantly because he sounded honest. No television gloss. No performed cowboy mythology. As the years went on, his name became bound up with that entire Austin era, the Willie years, Jerry Jeff Walker, Guy Clark, cramped clubs, long stretches of open road, musicians surviving on almost nothing because they believed the music was worth more than comfort ever could be. That is why this loss cuts deep. Joe Ely never sounded like nostalgia. He sounded like America before it got too careful and too polished. Tonight, in some old Texas bar or on some empty desert stretch, his songs still feel like wide open space. Willie Nelson did not arrive in this world as a legend. He was born into a flat, dry corner of Abbott, Texas, where hard days were simply the weather of life and nobody talked about being worn down because everyone already was. No stage lights waited for him. No promise that millions would one day hold their breath just to catch the sound of his voice. There was only a small town, a fractured beginning, and music. Willie Hugh Nelson entered the world on April 29, 1933, in the depth of the Great Depression, when survival itself was what most American families were focused on. Childhood was practical, not gentle, chores, church, sparse meals, and silence on the days when there wasn't enough of anything. His parents drifted away while he was still very small. His mother left early. His father followed not long after. It was Willie's grandparents who raised him and his sister Bobby, and what sounds simple in summary held far more inside it. A young child absorbing, early, the knowledge that people leave. Learning that love sometimes belongs to those who stay, not to those who were supposed to. Maybe that is where the ache in Willie's music comes from, not a performance of sadness, but the real thing, threaded into everything he does even when he is smiling, even when the crowd is laughing with him. His grandparents gave him faith, structure, and music. His grandfather placed a guitar in his hands at 6 years old and showed him a handful of chords. Just a few. But sometimes a few chords are all it takes to crack a life wide open. By 7, Willie had written his first song. By 9, he was performing with a local band. Most children that age are still making sense of the world around them. Willie was already trying to translate it into melody. He sang beside Bobby in church, and those old gospel songs taught him something that would never leave, how to sound both humble and wounded at once, how to carry a prayer without dressing it up, how to let the rough edges stay rough. Later, musicians and critics would marvel at his phrasing, the way he fell behind the beat and then slipped ahead of it, as if rhythm itself bent to accommodate him. But maybe that instinct did not begin in a recording booth. Maybe it started in Abbott, in a boy who never moved quite at the pace the world expected of him. He picked cotton as a child and hated every moment of it. So he found another way, playing dance halls and honky-tonks before he was fully grown, watching working people come to those places to shake off bad luck, sore bodies, overdue bills, and all the weight they carried every day. Willie watched what songs could do. A good one could make a tired man go still. It could bring a woman face to face with someone she'd spent months trying to forget. It could make strangers feel, for 3 minutes, that they were not holding the whole world alone. That was the first version of Willie Nelson, not the outlaw, not the icon, not the elder statesman under concert lights. Just a boy from Abbott who learned that music could carry what people were too proud, too guarded, or too broken to say themselves. And that is why, even now, when he walks onto a stage at 93, the room shifts before he sings a single note. Because somewhere inside that weathered voice, the boy is still there. The one who was left behind. The one who listened to everything. The one who survived by turning pain into something people could carry home and hum. Long before Willie Nelson became an image on a poster, he was just another songwriter hunched over a notebook in a small room, hoping someone would pay attention. And for a long time, almost no one truly did. That is one of the most disorienting parts of his story, because to younger generations he looks like a man who has simply always been there, a permanent feature of the American landscape. But there were years, long ones, when the music industry looked at him and saw an inconvenient problem. Too unusual. Too raw for certain rooms. Too country for others. Not smooth enough for Nashville in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when labels preferred polished men in pressed suits who seemed comfortable under floodlights. Willie never looked completely comfortable anywhere except beside a guitar. He moved through other work before music finally opened up. Radio DJ. Encyclopedia salesman. Clubs where people barely glanced toward the stage. Cheap motels. Long empty roads. More than a few nights wondering whether music would ever truly sustain him or simply keep him perpetually scraping by. Maybe that uncertainty wired itself into his voice too, because Willie never sang like someone who expected the world to hand him anything. He sang like someone hoping, quietly, to be understood. Then gradually, the songs began traveling farther than he did. In 1961, Patsy Cline recorded Crazy, and something shifted. Not dramatically, not overnight, but people started paying attention to the words, the simplicity of them, the sadness held inside them, the understanding that grief lands hardest when you refuse to over-explain it. Crazy became one of the enduring pillars of American music. And still, somehow, Willie himself remained in the wings. Faron Young scored a hit with Hello Walls. Ray Price recorded Nightlife. Other artists kept converting his writing into their own success while he remained the quiet architect nobody quite saw. To write the words the whole country sings, while wondering whether you truly belong in the same room, that is a particular kind of loneliness. There were years when the weight of it showed on him. Years when he softened his edges to meet Nashville's expectations, neater appearance, more conventional presentation, boardroom meetings, compromises that didn't fit his skin. But something restless inside Willie could never be fully contained, even when he tried. His personal life had real fractures. Marriages collapsed. Financial trouble found him more than once. The road could consume him in ways that hurt the people who loved him most. And yet people never stopped feeling close to him, because nothing about Willie Nelson ever felt constructed. By the early 1970s, finished with Nashville's demands, he came back to Texas. That choice didn't just change his life. It changed country music. Texas didn't ask him to be smoother. Texas let him be himself. The short hair was gone. The bandana appeared. His sound loosened like a long exhale. He let in folk, blues, western swing, the ghost of jazz phrasing. And something extraordinary happened. Young crowds, old cowboys, hippies, bikers, and lifelong country fans all ended up standing in the same field, singing the same songs. That should not have made any sense. But it did, because Willie carried something nearly impossible to manufacture. He sounded free. Not young, not chasing relevance, free. And somewhere in that transformation, America stopped hearing him as a country singer and started hearing him as a feeling. The man who understood loneliness without being swallowed by it. The man who aged openly and made it seem less like something to fear. And that is why today carries so much emotion for so many people. When fans look at Willie Nelson, they are not only watching one artist grow old. They are seeing the last living version of an America that sang through its pain rather than burying it. There came a point when Willie Nelson stopped belonging to music and started belonging to the road itself. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, he seemed to be everywhere at once: festival fields, television specials, stadium stages, small-town fairgrounds, always moving, always with trigger pressed against his chest as though the old guitar were not just an instrument but proof that certain things can survive the decades without losing what made them matter. That permanence is exactly what makes watching him now so emotionally complicated. Because for most of his life in the public eye, Willie never seemed old. Worn, yes. Tired sometimes. But never fragile. Then slowly, the landscape around him began to thin. Johnny Cash was gone. Waylon Jennings was gone. Chris Christopherson eventually retreated from public life. The voices bound up with the outlaw era faded one by one into memory. But Willie kept appearing beneath the lights, that sideways smile intact, still singing half behind the beat as though time had decided to follow his lead rather than the other way around. Recent years feel different in a way that is difficult to name precisely. Not because Willie has stopped, he has not. Even into his 90s he has continued touring, recording, and standing in front of crowds that now look at him with something beyond excitement, something closer to gratitude. When Last Man Standing arrived, the title alone was enough to undo people. It felt less like a promotional release and more like a private acknowledgement, Willie quietly saying something his audience had already felt but didn't want to put into words, that he really is the last man standing for so many of them. Every concert now carries a silence beneath the applause. Not dread, exactly. Awareness. Because the painful realization is not that Willie Nelson is slipping away. It's that people have finally let themselves understand he cannot stand on that stage forever. Something subtle began happening at Willie Nelson shows in recent years. Not on the stage. In the crowd. There was a time when people came expecting a party, cold drinks, old friends, every lyric shouted back toward the sky. Willie always felt permanent, like the road would simply keep carrying him indefinitely. Even as his hair whitened and his voice acquired new edges, audiences looked at him the same way they always had, like he would be back next summer, as reliable as the heat. Somewhere, that certainty started to change. You can almost feel the exact moment it arrives during a recent show. The lights drop. Trigger emerges first. Then Willie walks slowly into the light beneath that familiar braided hat, and the crowd is no longer just cheering, they are watching him closely, memorizing him, holding the moment in their hands as carefully as they can while it's still happening. Because age stopped being a number with Willie. At 93, each appearance is weighted with something extra. Not because he presents himself as frail, he doesn't. He still jokes. He still performs. He still travels. But audiences now understand something they spent decades refusing to acknowledge. Even legends are subject to time. That understanding sharpened after health scares began appearing in the news. In 2024, when Willie stepped back from several outlaw music festival dates after falling ill, the public reaction carried a force that went beyond ordinary concert news. The official word was measured. Rest was advised. He returned to the stage, but something had shifted in people's hearts. The comforting certainty of always had shown its crack. Songs that had lived in people's lives for decades started to land differently. Angel flying too close to the ground. Blue eyes crying in the rain. Always on my mind. They no longer float by as familiar old companions. They return with full weight, like memory rushing back all at once. For the women especially, the generation that grew up with his voice drifting through kitchen radios and car windows and late-night living rooms, Willie represents something beyond entertainment. He is continuity. He is a particular version of American life that felt slower and warmer and more human. Watching him age has quietly become something personal. Because when Willie steps into the lights today, people are not only reckoning with how old he is. They are reckoning with how old they are. He still smiles the same way. After everything, the endless miles, the grief, the money troubles, the health scares, the years of touring, the funerals for friends, the world remaking itself around him, he still steps onto a stage wearing that quiet expression that says life gave him plenty of hard days but never fully hardened him. That feels genuinely rare, especially now, especially for the people who have grown older alongside him. Because Willie was never the untouchable kind of star. He forgot lyrics. He missed notes. He lived hard for long stretches, loved imperfectly, made mistakes he didn't bother to hide. The IRS crisis of the 1990s could have gutted a lesser person entirely. Instead it only added another scar to the collection. And every scar made him more believable. His audience recognized themselves in him, not in the perfection, but in the getting back up. Now at 93, he carries something heavier than fame when he walks out to perform. He carries memory itself. When people look at him today they see their own old summers. Parents who have since passed. First dances in cramped halls. Long drives with a radio doing the talking. His music attached itself to people's actual lives in a way that almost never happens with younger artists anymore. That is why recent performances feel charged before he even opens his mouth, because the crowd already knows, not consciously perhaps, but somewhere deeper. They know they are present for the final living chapter of something larger than one person. Willie is among the last surviving symbols of a generation of country music that was never built for algorithms or viral trends or 30-second attention spans. That world moved slower. Songs breathed longer. Pain sounded honest. And somehow, Willie outlived nearly all of it. He is still there beside Trigger, still stepping into the light, still singing as though he is having a quiet conversation with one old friend at a time. That is the part that is hardest to sit with. Not that Willie Nelson is gone, he isn't. But for the first time, America has begun watching him with the full awareness that one day he will be. Maybe Willie understands that too. Maybe it lives somewhere in the unhurried pace of his recent songs. Somewhere inside Last Man Standing. Somewhere in the space between verses. Not fear. Just the quiet knowledge that no road goes on forever. But tonight, at least, Willie Nelson is still traveling it. Don Schlitz has died at 73. Even people who could not have picked his face out of a crowd have spent decades living inside the words he wrote without ever knowing it. That is what true songwriting greatness looks like, the pen that shapes the culture while the hand holding it stays largely invisible. The voice at the front of the stage gets the ovation. The person who wrote what that voice is singing sits quietly somewhere to the side, shaping American music one carefully constructed verse at a time. Don Schlitz did exactly that, year after year, with extraordinary consistency. When Kenny Rogers released The Gambler in 1978, it crossed every boundary a country song is supposed to stay inside. People who had never willingly listened to country music still found themselves knowing the chorus, quoting it in conversation, passing it down to their kids. That single song could have defined a career entirely and nobody would have argued. But Schlitz kept building. George Strait. Randy Travis. Keith Whitley. Alabama. His fingerprints appeared all over the most celebrated years of country radio. Within Nashville, songwriters spoke of him in a particular tone, the kind reserved for people who make the very difficult look deceptively easy. He was born in North Carolina and eventually became one of the quiet architects of Music Row during the 1980s and 1990s, when a country song still felt like a story drawn from actual lived experience, broken relationships, late drives home, small-town pride and small-town heartbreak, faith-tested and sometimes renewed. By all accounts, Don Schlitz moved through all of that success without losing the thread of who he was. Grounded. Undramatic. Devoted to the work itself above everything else. There is a particular kind of grief in realizing how many of our own memories are attached to people whose faces we would never recognize, weddings, road trips, old jukebox nights in bars that probably don't exist anymore, fathers singing off-key in pickup trucks on summer afternoons. The voice may have belonged to someone else. But the words were Don Schlitz's.